My beloved child, stop scrolling for just a moment. Something is waiting for you inside these words, and if your heart has been unusually restless lately, if you have felt a strange heaviness followed by sudden moments of peace, if someone has been crossing your mind without explanation, then listen closely. What you are about to hear was meant to find you at a very particular moment. Not because you searched for it. Not because you planned for it, but because there are moments when heaven allows a hidden story to move closer to the surface, and today, something moved. Someone opened their heart to your soulmate, and what they said may have changed everything. You may not know who this person is. You may not even know what conversation took place. You may be sitting there wondering why your heart suddenly feels as though it is waiting for news that has not arrived yet. But pause here, do not rush past this, because there is a reason this message found you before the full story reached your ears. There are things happening beyond what your eyes can see. There are conversations you were never present for. There are emotions being confessed in rooms you have never entered. And there is a person connected to your story who has been carrying something in silence for longer than you realize. Your soulmate has been standing at the edge of a decision, not necessarily a decision about whether they love you. Something deeper, a decision about whether they are finally ready to admit what they feel, and today, somebody reached into that silence, somebody asked a question, somebody said something your soulmate was not prepared to hear. At first, they tried to dismiss it, they tried to change the subject, they tried to make their answer sound casual, but then something happened. The conversation touched the place they had been protecting. The place where your name lives, the place where memories have been stored, the place where they have wondered, more than once, what would happen if they stopped running from what their heart already knows. And my child, this is where the story becomes more mysterious. Because the person who opened their heart to your soulmate may not have intended to reveal everything. They may have started with something simple, a question, a confession, a memory. Perhaps they said, "You still think about them, don't you?" And for a moment, everything became quiet, because sometimes one sentence can unlock a door that someone has spent months trying to keep closed. Your soulmate did not immediately answer. They looked away, they breathed differently, they remembered, and the silence itself became an answer. There are moments when a person's heart speaks before their mouth has permission to speak. This was one of those moments. And perhaps you have been feeling that same strange pull. Perhaps you have wondered why certain memories have returned recently, why an old song suddenly sounds different, why a familiar place brings a person to mind, why you sometimes wake up with an unexplained feeling that something is shifting. You thought it was random, you thought it was nostalgia, you thought you were simply missing someone. But sometimes the heart notices movement before the mind receives information, and today, there was movement. Your soulmate has not forgotten. That is the first thing you need to understand. They may have acted distracted, they may have appeared distant, they may have buried themselves in work, responsibilities, conversations, routines, or even other people, but distance does not always mean absence. Sometimes distance is where a person goes when their emotions become too powerful to organize. They needed time, they needed silence, They needed to understand why the thought of you could still affect them after everything that happened, and somebody today forced them to look at that truth, not gently, not gradually, but directly. The conversation became more personal than expected, the person speaking to your soulmate noticed something. They noticed the change in their expression, they noticed the hesitation, they noticed that when your soulmate talked about you, their voice became softer, they noticed that certain details were remembered with impossible precision. The little things, the way you looked at them when you were trying not to smile, the way you said certain words, a place you once visited, a promise that was never properly completed, a moment that seemed ordinary at the time but became unforgettable later, and suddenly your soulmate realized something terrifyingly beautiful. They were not remembering the past, they were remembering a feeling that never completely left. That is why this message matters, because the person who spoke to your soulmate today did not simply ask about you, they asked about the version of your soulmate that existed when you were close, and that question opened a door. Behind that door was regret. Behind the regret was longing, behind the longing was love, and behind the love was a truth your soulmate has been afraid to say aloud. They are not as emotionally free as they have pretended to be. They may have told themselves they moved on. They may have convinced others that everything is fine. They may even have convinced themselves for a while. But there is a difference between moving forward and moving on. A person can continue living while one corner of their heart remains somewhere else, and your soulmate knows exactly where that corner is. It is connected to you. Now listen carefully, because this is where many people misunderstand what is happening. This does not mean you should chase them. It does not mean you should force a conversation. It does not mean you should send a message simply because you suddenly feel emotional. No, the movement happening now is not asking you to run toward the door. It is asking you to recognize that a door may already be opening on the other side. There is a timing to certain things, a timing that cannot be forced. A timing that becomes visible only after both hearts have finished learning what they needed to learn. Your soulmate had lessons. You had lessons. There were wounds that needed to become wisdom. There were attachments that needed to become surrender. There were expectations that needed to become trust, and perhaps you wondered why nothing happened when you wanted it to happen. Perhaps you prayed, perhaps you waited, perhaps you finally told yourself, if it is meant for me, it will find me. And then you tried to forget, but heaven does not always move according to the calendar of your impatience. Sometimes what looks like delay is preparation. Sometimes silence is not rejection. Sometimes silence is the space where two people become capable of handling the truth they once could not carry. Your soulmate has been changing in ways you could not witness. That is what you need to hear tonight. They have been confronting themselves. And today's conversation touched the exact wound they have been avoiding. The person who spoke to them may have said something like, "Why did you let them go?" And that question landed differently, because your soulmate knew the answer they had been giving everyone was not the whole truth. Maybe they said timing was wrong, maybe they blamed circumstances, maybe they blamed distance, maybe they said the relationship was complicated, maybe they claimed they were protecting you. but underneath all those explanations was something much simpler. They were afraid of being vulnerable. Afraid of being rejected, afraid that loving you would require them to change, afraid that if they came back, you would ask questions they were not ready to answer, and most of all, afraid that you no longer felt the same. That fear has been growing quietly, because the possibility of losing you forever is different from simply being apart. When someone believes they can return whenever they want, they can postpone courage, but when they begin to believe the door may actually close, the heart becomes honest. And today, your soulmate heard something that made that possibility feel real. Someone told them something about you, something they did not expect. Something that made them realize you may not be standing still anymore. Maybe someone mentioned that you seem different. Maybe they heard that you have become stronger. Maybe they learned that you are no longer waiting for the past to rescue you. Maybe they discovered that your life is moving forward, and instead of feeling relieved, your soulmate felt something unexpected: fear. Not fear of you, fear of missing you, fear that while they were trying to understand their own heart, your heart might have learned how to live without them. That thought stayed with them, even after the conversation ended. They carried it home. They carried it into the quiet, and when nobody was watching, they allowed themselves to feel what they had been avoiding. They thought about you, not casually, not for a few seconds. They remembered the beginning, the middle, the ending, and especially the things they never said. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from realizing you had the chance to speak and chose silence. Your soulmate knows that pain. They have replayed certain moments. They have wondered what would have happened if they had been more honest, if they had stayed a little longer, if they had called, if they had answered differently, if they had admitted what they were feeling instead of pretending they were unaffected. And now someone has brought all of it back to the surface. But there is more. Because the person who opened their heart today did not stop with the question, they shared something of their own. They had been holding back. They told your soulmate about a conversation, a realization, or a moment that changed how they viewed love, and while they were speaking, your soulmate recognized themselves in the story. They realized they had been repeating an old pattern, running when things became real, hiding behind pride, waiting for certainty before taking a single step. And suddenly they understood why you had affected them so deeply. You were never simply another person. You became a mirror. You showed them what they were capable of feeling, and that frightened them, because once someone has seen their own heart clearly, they cannot permanently return to pretending they never saw it. Tonight, your soulmate may be asking themselves questions they have avoided for a long time. What if I was wrong? What if I misunderstood what was happening? What if they were the person I was supposed to choose? What if I waited too long? What if they have already moved on? And there is one question that hurts more than all the others. What if they still love me, but they are finally learning not to need me? That question changes people. Because love and need are not the same thing. Your growth may be the very thing that makes your soulmate realize what they lost. Not because you are trying to make them jealous. Not because you are pretending to be unavailable. But because you are becoming whole, and when someone becomes whole, they stop begging another person to complete them. That kind of transformation can be felt from a distance, even without words, even without contact, even without explanation. There is something about genuine inner change that alters the energy of every relationship connected to you. You may have noticed it. You may have felt less desperate, less willing to accept confusion, less interested in chasing answers. You may still love them, but something inside you has become quieter, stronger, more surrendered. And that is precisely why this moment matters, because your soulmate is beginning to sense that your heart is no longer waiting in the same way. They can feel the possibility of losing access to you, and suddenly, the things they once considered easy to postpone are becoming urgent. But do not mistake urgency for readiness. That distinction matters. A person can miss you and still be afraid. A person can love you and still need to mature. A person can want to return and still have work to do. That is why heaven is not telling you to rush. You are being asked to watch, to listen, to notice what happens next, because the conversation that happened today was not the conclusion. It was the beginning of a chain reaction. One sentence led to another. One memory awakened another. One confession exposed another. And before the conversation ended, your soulmate heard something that they were never supposed to hear so soon. Something about you. Something that made them stop breathing for a moment. Something that made them realize there was a part of your story they did not know. And when they heard it, their entire understanding of what happened between you began to shift. They asked one question. Just one. But the answer they received may explain why you have been feeling that strange pull in your spirit, because the person sitting across from your soulmate looked at them and said, "There is something you need to know about them." And my beloved child, that is where the story truly begins, because what came next was not a casual detail. It was not gossip. It was not an ordinary piece of information. It was a revelation about your heart, a revelation your soulmate had never been told, and when they heard it, they realized they may have completely misunderstood your silence. They thought you had stopped caring. They thought you had closed the door. They thought your distance was rejection. But what they were about to discover was something else entirely. Something you never had the courage to say, something they never had the courage to ask, and when those words finally reached them, your soulmate did not respond immediately. They simply sat there, silent, processing, remembering, and then their eyes changed. Because for the first time, they understood why you disappeared into silence when you did. They understood why you stopped explaining yourself. They understood why you stopped chasing, and they understood something else, something far more powerful. You had not walked away because you stopped loving them. You walked away because you finally realized that love without truth was slowly breaking your heart. Your soulmate heard that, and something inside them cracked open. But what they said next, what they admitted after hearing the truth about you, is the part you were never meant to hear through ordinary human conversation. It is the part that was hidden behind every delay, every silence, every unanswered question. And before the conversation ended, your soulmate finally spoke the words they had been afraid to say for far too long. They said your name, Then they whispered something that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. And my child, you need to hear exactly what they said, because those words are the reason this message found you today. My beloved child, they said your name, not casually. Not as though they were remembering someone from a distant chapter. They said it with the weight of someone finally touching a truth they had spent too long avoiding. And then the room became silent. The person sitting across from your soulmate waited. They did not interrupt. They could see that something inside your soulmate had shifted. Your soulmate lowered their eyes, took a slow breath, and finally admitted something they had never been able to say without feeling exposed. I never stopped caring. Those 4 words carried more emotion than an entire confession, because sometimes the simplest truth is the one we spend the longest trying to hide. Your soulmate had convinced themselves that silence was strength, that pretending not to care would make the pain disappear, that keeping busy would make the memories fade, that time would eventually erase the questions. But time did not erase you. It only taught them how to hide the evidence. And today, somebody saw through it. Somebody recognized what your soulmate had been carrying. That person opened their own heart first because they knew your soulmate would never open theirs without being given permission to be vulnerable. They told them about their own regrets, their own missed opportunity, their own person they once loved but were too afraid to fight for. And as they spoke, your soulmate listened differently. Not with the detached expression they had practiced, not with the usual defenses, but with recognition, because the story being told was beginning to sound like their own. They realized that sometimes people do not lose love because love disappears. Sometimes they lose it because fear makes them hesitate until hesitation becomes a decision. And your soulmate suddenly understood something painful. Every time they said, "Not yet," they were still choosing. Every time they told themselves, "Maybe later," they were still choosing. Every time they waited for the perfect moment, they were allowing another moment to pass. And while they were waiting for certainty, your life continued. That realization hurt, but it also awakened something that had been asleep, something that had been waiting beneath the surface of their pride. Courage, not perfect courage, not fearless courage, just enough courage to admit that they were not as over you as they had claimed. They looked at the person in front of them and said, "I thought I had more time." And there it was, the sentence they had been carrying inside themselves. "I thought I had more time." Maybe you understand that feeling. Maybe you have lived through your own version of it. Maybe there was a moment when you thought someone would always be there. A message could always be sent tomorrow. An apology could always happen later. A conversation could always happen when life became easier. But hearts do not live on schedules. And sometimes tomorrow arrives with a completely different reality. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that. They were realizing that the opportunity they once treated as permanent may have been temporary. And then the person across from them said something that made them look up. They said, "Then why haven't you told them?" Your soulmate had no answer, not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much. How do you explain years of feelings compressed into a single conversation? How do you tell someone that you missed them while you were the one who walked away? How do you admit that pride disguised itself as indifference? How do you explain that every attempt to move forward somehow carried an invisible comparison to what you once had? Your soulmate knew the truth. They had compared, they had remembered, they had wondered, they had tried to replace a feeling that could not simply be replaced. And perhaps the hardest realization was this: they had not been searching for someone better, they had been searching for someone who made them feel the way you did, and that is not the same thing. There is a difference between meeting new people and finding the same emotional home. They had met people, they had spoken to people, they had smiled, they had continued living, but there was something about you that remained unfinished. Not because you were perfect, not because the connection was effortless, but because something real had happened.